about 12 minutes late, which is a record so far for this conference, I think. We're coming to the final interactive plenary session, and we're tremendously fortunate to find three exceptional individuals who epitomise different constituencies and experiences that are crucial to truly understanding what makes the United Nations tick. I'm going to introduce everyone very briefly. You can find longer bios for the first two speakers in your packs. Ambassador Anne Anderson tremendously, graciously accepted a last-minute invitation to come in only last night, and has been staying up all night preparing her remarks for us. So we're very particularly grateful to her for joining the panel and bringing her expertise. So we're going to start with Jan Wouters, who's Professor of International Law and International Organizations and Director of the Levine Center for Global Governance Studies. He's as many of you know, he's a prolific and very distinguished author, trainer of international and national delegates, and a frequent commentator in the media. He's the epitome of expert academic and lawyer engaged on UN matters. Secondly, we'll have Ian Levine, who's Program Director at Human Rights Watch. He's had a long, distinguished career in both NGOs and the UN, serving for 10 years. He was for NSF and Save the Children in UNICEF in Mozambique and the Sudan. Served as Advocacy Director for humanitarian issues for UNICEF, and worked for Amnesty International at the UN as their representative. And then finally we'll have Ambassador Anne Anderson, who represents Ireland as its ambassador at the United Nations in New York. Previously she was ambassador to France, Monaco, but very rarely she was also the ambassador of Ireland to the UN in Geneva and their ambassador to the European Union. So it's incredible that you managed to survive three multilateral processes and posts and keep your sanity, but that I'm sure has given you quite remarkable cross-institutional insights into the multilateral field. So I will now turn to them. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and so be thinking of your questions as people are speaking. Over to you, then. Thank you.
So, friends, as we used to say in ACUNS, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the international prosecutors, and in fact my talk is a promotion talk in disguise for a book of over 1,000 pages, which we have just published with Oxford University Press, Great Britain, which is why OUP New York did not yet have it on display here at the conference. It has the title International Prosecutors, and what is special about this volume? So here's the promotion. The international criminal justice, as you know, involves a multitude of actors, but none are more identified with the whole undertaking than the prosecutors. And we found it somewhat surprising that there are very few texts on the subject matter. And we try to fill that gap, although I should stress from the outset, very important, our study concerns the office of international prosecutors, not the individuals. So you will not find, and I will not speak about any juicy stories on Luis Moreno Ocampo bullying the Sudanese ambassador at the end of the Security Council session, the 6th of June, or Carla Del Ponte allowing the bribing of witnesses and this kind of stuff. I will not touch upon it. It's the office, not the individuals. And there are indeed enough personal accounts. You have seen the memoirs of people like Carla Del Ponte, Richard Goldstone, Louis Arbour. We depersonalized our study and we focus on the actual prosecution. And a second choice that we made for the book was we really focus on a thematic approach. So thematic rather than tribunal per tribunal. we've taken a look, basically in a cross-cutting manner, on all international tribunals from Nuremberg and Tokyo until the ICC, but really in a thematic order, and, if you wish, chronologically, so really following the successive phases of the life of a trial, basically, and the institutional process. So, I mean, I think that makes for an interesting approach. The starting point of that study, and of my talk here, is that the prosecution shapes the practice of a tribunal and the legacy of a tribunal more than any other organ. It is the public face of the international criminal justice. It is the prosecutor whom war criminals fear most, and it is the prosecutor in whom victims vest their hopes. It's the voice that addresses public opinion through the media. It's the prosecutor. He or she is also, if you wish, the principal strategist whose decisions and actions really shape international criminal justice. International investigations, indictments, and prosecutions are also to have, and often are intended to have, political impact. I'll come to that in a moment. The prosecution, in other words, in more than one way, is the locus of power in international criminal justice. And in that sense, he's also really called from time to time to assume certain political function. It's the prosecutor who knocks at the door of the various states and international organizations to request their cooperation or to use their leverage. This outside the courtroom activity sets international prosecutors apart from the bench and the defense. And the fact that the prosecutor is a player like no other in the international justice administration persuaded us to make such a systematic examination. Now, the book is 1,000 pages, I'm not going to quote intensely from it. What's important, we have basically three main findings that I would like to share with you. First of all, international justice and the prosecutor's role is entering a new era. Secondly, international prosecutors not only have international prosecutions, not only have political overtures, but they are in themselves imminently political and controversial. And thirdly, the accountability issue. There is more transparency needed, we think, as to the discretionary powers that prosecutors exercise, but it's difficult to go really beyond that without touching on something very important, that's the prosecutor's independence. Let me elaborate, if I may, briefly on those three main findings. First of all, international criminal justice is entering a new era. It's obvious the ad hoc tribunals are well into their completion phases. The last remaining ICTY fugitives have been sent to The Hague. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia have begun what will probably be its final trial. The Special Court for Sierra Leone is in the closing stages of its final trial, and the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, yet another court in The Hague, has filed, and the prosecutor has filed an indictment. So then we have the ICC. The ICC, as we know, this morning we have seen the taking of the oath of office of the new prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. And so that's likely to mark also another turning point in the history of the court. Like the ad hoc tribunals, the court's first decade has been shaped by the way the prosecutor has selected cases and defendants, managed the office of the prosecutor, and conducted investigations and cases. This remains, of course, but the new prosecutor will now have to turn on the difficult task of handling more trials and appeals, and will quickly have to learn from the mistakes of the first trial. The international prosecutor not only responds to international events, but is now really more and more an important international actor in his own right. Decisions made in prosecutors' offices will in all likelihood shape the next decade of international criminal justice. So that's a finding with regard to the, say, if you wish, new stage or new era of international criminal justice. Second point, international prosecutions, as said, not only have political overtones, they are in themselves eminently political and controversial. Let me elaborate a little bit on that. Unlike, as you know, most domestic criminality, international criminality, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, is often committed for political purposes, for example, to ethnically cleanse a geographical area. And it's more than once steered by leading political actors who deploy the state's or another political entity's machinery for this aim. Precisely because international crimes are informed by political grievances, international prosecutors, when indicting those who pulled the political and military levers, act themselves as political actors, whose decisions can affect reconciliation between various factions, upset the international and national balance of power, and set in motion a process towards regime change. Think what Carla Del Ponte did with Milosevic. Think what Moreno Ocampo did when he applied for an arrest warrant for Gaddafi. So, I mean, in that sense, international prosecutors hold the most political office in international criminal justice. Now, what about the legal side of this political dimension? Well, legally, in a way, that political dimension is translated into the whole area, or the whole notion of the discretion of the prosecutor. In other words, his power to decide what situations to investigate and who to indict for alleged atrocities. The prosecutor, or if you wish, the international community, when setting up a tribunal, could restrict this discretionary role. For instance, the prosecutor, in a certain way, if he wanted to, could depoliticize part of his job by, for instance, adopting a number of criteria that will guide his selection of situations and cases. And applying such criteria may, in a certain way, lead to more accountability if you want. It would maybe dispel concerns about arbitrary choices, and it would allow the prosecutor and the tribunal at large to gain credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of affected community and international public opinion. But it's a nice idea in theory, adopting guidelines and criteria. To put them in practice is quite a different matter. And as transpires from our analysis in the book of the selection policy of prosecutors of various tribunals, prosecutors only rarely refer to previously adopted selection criteria when they actually take decisions. Transparency, would that be a good thing? I think that transparency indeed may be useful here, but in many cases, actually the interesting thing, as we found out, is that the political overlords of the prosecutor, those who wrote the rules of the game, who set up the International Tribunal, may have already infused the very mandate of the prosecutor with political selectivity. That was most glaringly the case at the tribunals in Nuremberg and Tokyo, where international prosecutors were expected only to target the Axis powers and not the victors of the Second World War. You could say, yes, that's Nuremberg and Tokyo, we have gone beyond that stage. Well, political pre-selection of cases has not entirely disappeared from present-day tribunals. With the exception of the ICC, all these tribunals have been set up ad hoc by political actors, international organizations and or governments, to deal with particular events, limited ratione temporis, ratione loci, ratione materiae. These limitations, as well as the choice to not establish a tribunal for comparable atrocities, are the result of political rather than legal choices by political operators. And we have quite a number of, say, chapters dealing with that. And you could say, we're in a new era. We have the ICC as a permanent international criminal court, and that has limited the space for external political influence peddling and drastically enhanced the prosecutor's independence, as witnessed by his powers to initiate an investigation proprio motu. That is true. But even the ICC prosecutor may not escape becoming subservient to politics, because the various jurisdictional triggering mechanisms may allow the United Nations Security Council or states to predetermine the situation, to be investigated by the prosecutor. And since the Security Council has the power under Article 16 of the statute to defer investigations by the prosecutor, he could also intervene, as you may recall was done in 2002 and 2003 in a very, I think, unfortunate manner. Now, this being said, an international prosecutor has a sizable amount of real power, real political power. And that's mainly the power to select cases, to select suspects. Now, that really raises certain very tricky issues. For instance, in an intensely political environment, can the prosecutor defend his choices to go after such leaders as Taylor and al-Bashir, while allowing others who committed similar crimes to get off the hook? Is the prosecutor not pursuing an extremely political agenda in these cases by aiming to cut off the head of the snake and thereby inevitably calling in a certain way for regime change? Is the prosecutor always led by the law and the evidentiary materials his office has collected? Answers to these questions are almost impossible to give, as the deliberations at the office of the prosecutor are confidential, and official explanations tend to be rather terse, typically only citing the evidence. I come to my third and last point, and that is about accountability. I think indeed, as I've said, the credibility of international criminal justice would be increased if more transparency came there, especially as regards certain discretionary choices that the prosecutor takes. But, again, we have to watch out, because there is a kind of hand-in-hand relationship between discretion and independence. There are limits to what you can do by making the prosecutor more accountable, because it would possibly also affect his or her independence. And for the prosecutor, it remains a challenge to reconcile the demands for transparency and accountability, which are currently expected from an entity that exercises power, and the need to maintain his independence vis-à-vis the various stakeholders, not in the least the political actors who would like to make the prosecutor subservient to their own interests. I stop here. Let me just end with a quote of Napoleon Bonaparte. He reportedly once said that the investigating magistrate is the most powerful person in France. International prosecutors may not be the most powerful persons in the world. Their power, as we know, is hemmed in various ways by institutional and political constraints, much more than national prosecutors. But they still have a considerable amount of power. This is evidenced by their right to initiate investigations proprio motu, their discretion to select crime scenes and defendants. And this power, like any power, should be used wisely for the benefit of the international community. And a wise exercise of power by international prosecutors involves a realization that he operates in an intensely political environment. And I think also, apart from having to develop good working relationships with a large number of actors, including political actors, he also has to make sure that he surrounds himself internally at his office with people who are smarter than he is. In other words, who can claim competence and expertise in specific fields of relevance for the prosecutor. As we were told at the lunch debate what Kofi Annan did in his office. And I think in that respect it's no secret that some prosecutors have done better in this regard than others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that excellent first presentation. Continuing on the theme of individuals as global actors, Ian is going to speak to us about the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thanks very much. I'm not quite sure how I follow a man who's just published a 1,000-page book, except to say that I haven't. On the other hand, if you go to our website, we have a powerful press release this morning about Syrian sexual violence, so that's all I can offer in counterpoint. Francois Truffaut, the great French film director, once said that every film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And that tends to be how I approach presentations. So please don't expect me to be as cogent or narratively consistent as Jan has been. But he, I think, has started off the panel really well and provocatively and thoughtfully. I'm going to sort of continue in a similar vein, except that I have no qualms about gossiping about individuals. It's the best of my ability. I know that you talked earlier during this conference about Kofi Annan and his contribution to the UN system, and You will all recall his famous and inspiring words from his 2005 UN Reform Report, where he defined the three great purposes of the UN system as being development, security, and human rights, all of which he said must be underpinned by the rule of law. And he went on to say that without development there can be no security, without security there can be no development, and without human rights there can be neither development nor peace and security. In that sense, human rights do, or at least should, lie at the heart of the UN, of this essential institution. And that is a bold and arguably quixotic claim to make. After all, the UN is deeply and inherently a political institution in the best and worst senses of that word, full of competing and often venal strategic interests. And the promotion and the protection of human rights, the idea that the dignity of each and every human being has to be protected and preserved for no other reason than they are human beings, represent an extraordinarily strong and principled challenge to the strategic self-interest that most states bring to the UN system. And this challenge, I think, provides an essential context to the question that I've been asked to grapple with, whether the UN Human Rights Commissioner can and does provide a principled voice in a political system. It's not only an important question about her role, but it goes, in a sense, to the heart of the institution itself, whether it can provide principled leadership for human rights. A question that I would argue reveals much about its moral standing, its effectiveness, and its relevance. My wife told me if I speak at an academic conference, I have to do two things. I have to have a title with a semicolon, which I have, and I have to present a thesis. And I guess my thesis, which I will try and play out in sort of 6 or 7 minutes, is that at the heart of the great challenge for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is whether she is able to manage a series of competing identities which are inherent to this role. And that, as I just said, that those competing identities and her ability to manage them in many ways go to the heart of the moral standing of the institution itself. So what are some of those competing identities? I'm going to lay out just a few very quickly and then focus just in the 5 or so minutes I have remaining to focus on a couple of them in a little more detail. Is the High Commissioner for Human Rights the unofficial leader of the global human rights movement, or the manager of a large bureaucracy with 1,000+ staff and $400 million budget? Or both? Can she be the voice of the conscience of the universality of human rights and the principles and standards that they represent? Or is she a high-level official of the intergovernmental system, a servant to the interests of the states who run that system? Or both? How does she balance the obligations to monitor and document human rights violations in some of the most abusive and oppressive countries in the world versus the technical support and capacity building that she offers to governments and to the machinery and the mechanisms of the international human rights system? And perhaps in many ways most difficult, how does she balance the imperative to lead the process of mainstreaming human rights through the whole UN system, so that the UN system really is based on human rights, as Kofi Annan argued, against the equally strong imperative to be an independent and principled protector of human rights within that very politicized system? Now, to give context to my remarks, I am the first to recognize that it's very easy for me to be critical. I am speaking from the perspective of a relatively small human rights advocacy NGO. We are smaller, we are more agile, we are more responsive than the Office of the High Commissioner can ever be. More importantly, we are independent of states' interests. We take no money from governments as a matter of principle, and we are not part of any intergovernmental process. We are able to speak truth to power in the way that the High Commissioner for Human Rights can only envy. So it's easy for me to be critical, and I will be, because I never miss the opportunity to do so. But when one considers some of the real constraints that the High Commissioner operates under, a lack of support from many of the agencies and departments within the UN system, inadequate resources for its many tasks, and serious efforts by a number, and one can argue many, states to undermine, weaken and torpedo the independence and effectiveness of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's hard not to be impressed by many of the achievements. Let me focus on a couple of questions. Firstly, the idea of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights as a high-level advocate, a principled voice of the conscience of humanity, if one forgives such a pretentious phrase, as against the intergovernmental role that she plays. She is a servant of the intergovernmental system, but those of us in the global human rights movement, and particularly the victims of human rights violations, look to her office for inspiration, for determination, for vision, and for a robust defense of the principles for which we stand. And the reality is, as I said before, she will never meet our expectations. She can never say what Salil Shetty, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, can say, nor what Ken Lafayette could say. But she does have, if she's to have credibility, if she is to have authority as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, she does have to be able to articulate our vision, our principles, and our values, even against the political interests of member states. And I have to say that this High Commissioner, as Louise Arbour, her predecessor, and Mary Robinson, who came before her, have frequently done an extremely good job in that sense. Just two issues to mention very quickly, where I think she's done a particularly good job. On the Arab Spring, she's provided a very principled voice in many respects. In Egypt, for example, and of course, profoundly relevant given the events in Egypt in the last 36 hours, in the earliest days of the crisis there, of the uprising there, she spoke out very strongly, urging Egypt's senior military and political leaders to act now, as she said, or face or risk future prosecution for complicity in serious crimes. Another area where she's done extremely important work has been in efforts to mainstream LGBT rights, the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people into the UN human rights system. There's been tremendous resistance from many member states, and she has been a very principled and articulate voice for the promotion and protection of these rights. And as she herself said very well, when I raise these issues, some complain I'm pushing for new rights or special rights for LGBT people. But there is nothing new or special about the right to life and security of person, the right to freedom from discrimination. These and other rights are universal. And the importance of her articulating the idea of the universality of these rights for a group of people who suffer so much discrimination and oppression cannot be overestimated. Let me just say a few words on the mainstreaming of human rights. I began by talking about Kofi Annan's vision for the mainstreaming of human rights within the UN system. Words that really remind us of how ambitious the human rights project is and what a key challenge it is for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it creates a real dilemma for her. How much does she insist on independence for the High Commissioner's office within the UN system, and how much does she push for integration of her office's work with those of other departments and agencies in order to ensure that human rights is part of the work of the diplomatic, peacekeeping, political development and humanitarian parts of the system. And these are really difficult questions, because while in principle all the pillars of the UN system, the political, the peacekeeping, the development, the humanitarian, the human rights and so on, are equal, the reality is that there is a clear and well-understood hierarchy with the political, the peacekeeping and the diplomatic at the top and the human rights at the bottom. And she constantly has to deal with special representatives of the Secretary Generals, political leaders in some of the most important countries for the UN system, trying to marginalize and push back and conceal human rights reporting that may well be inconvenient for efforts to promote diplomatic solutions. In addition, she has to deal with threats to at least perceptions of the neutrality and impartiality of human rights reporting and the documenting of human rights violations, particularly in countries where the UN Security Council has effectively taken a position in in support of one side or the other. For example, 15 months ago, when the UN system was dealing with the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire, the Security Council took a position in support of Ouattara, the challenger for the Cote d'Ivoire presidency, who was kept out from the presidency by Laurent Gbagbo, the incumbent president, who would not give up his office despite elections in which he was thrown out. And in the midst of a situation where the Security Council and the peacekeeping operation had taken a political position, the human rights component was expected to provide impartial documentation of human rights violations. All of that said, there has been tremendous progress in mainstreaming human rights into the peace and security functions of the UN system. Virtually every single UN peacekeeping operation now, with the exception of one, has a human rights component. The High Commissioner briefs the Security Council on Protection of Civilians, and we've seen within the UN system, the High Commissioner has been able to push, for example, the Secretary General to take a principled position on human rights and accountability issues, where his political instincts weren't necessarily taking him. But perhaps the biggest failing of the mainstreaming endeavour has been in development. Despite the fact that the Secretary General's 5-year action plan, which he announced this year when he began his second term, starts off with the first 3 goals in development, the Millennium Development Goals, climate change, and post-2015 development goals, the human rights voice in the development process has been weak. And it's been extremely difficult to get those parts of the UN system that lead on development to really move beyond the rhetoric on the importance of human rights and development processes. Even in some of the most basic aspects of recognizing and understanding that participation and accountability in development processes, which all recognize as being essential for development, that they will not happen without respect for the right to freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly. The UN system has not provided a real push for the integration of human rights into successful development processes. And even when we have rhetorical flourishes from UNDP and UNICEF and others talking about inequalities and inequities and disparities and the importance of rights-based development, that is not taking them towards a real confrontation of development actors and development processes that marginalize and ignore the central role that human rights have to play in effective, just, and sustainable development. I have a minute left, just 5 points to make very, very quickly, just to kind of kick off a discussion. Firstly, if the voice of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is going to remain principled and independent, states have to do more to robustly protect the independence of her office, its mandate, and her voice. Secondly, politically, we need to see much more emphasis on the importance of human rights and development processes. We've seen good progress on peace and security. We have not seen the same progress in development. Thirdly, as important as the individual and the office are, we will not see the proper integration and mainstreaming of human rights in the UN system until the promotion and protection of human rights are a key accountability for all UN staffers, starting with the resident coordinators of the UN system in country, who frequently are the biggest obstacle to the promotion and protection of human rights within the work of the UN system. And lastly, more resources. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has a budget of $400 million, which sounds a lot, but it represents something like 3% of the budget of the entire UN system. And yet she's held responsible for not only running the entire human rights machinery of the international system, but also mainstreaming human rights within that system. And 3% is not enough. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much for those really highly insightful and perceptive set of reflections on the role of the High Commissioner. And so, turning now to you, Ambassador, you will see the tone that don't feel the need to be diplomatic at all in your remarks. You're among friends. We would really invite you to pick up some of the themes from the first 2 panelists from your own experience, which has been extensive of looking at the role of individuals in the wider UN system and in the areas UN works. And at the risk of putting you on the spot, we'd also be really interested in your insights on the importance and role of ambassadors as individual actors. So, Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I thought I had a bit of license here as a last-minute stand-in and the final speaker, and now you just throw me more challenges as I'm about to speak. So we'll see what we can do. The title, Individuals as Global Actors, it's absolutely tantalising, obviously, and one could make umpteen different discourses on that theme. As I was thinking about it, and let me say here that mostly what I will talk about, and I'll come to it in a moment or so, is individuals at the United Nations, individual people carrying out particular responsibilities, and I'll talk a bit about ambassadors. But, you know, the mind wanders more widely when you look at a topic like this. And I was thinking about, you know, recent times, individuals who have become global actors in different ways. If you think about the Tunisian street vendor that put the match to be the tinderbox of the Arab Spring. If you think about the individuals that were out in Tahrir Square, who with their tweets and their blogs and all of that, in fact became global actors. If you think about somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi, currently very much in the news, obviously on her first trip abroad, and how her steadfastness over so long made her such an icon, such a great figure. So you think about how individuals have that possibility to become really global actors, but of course you think about the limitations as well. Obviously, for the Tunisian street vendor, the self-immolation was the act in itself. In the other cases, the papers are full of these days, you saw the New York Times this morning, the limitations really of the activists in Tahrir Square. Thomas Friedman had a very good article last Sunday about Facebook meets bricks and mortar, and the difficulty that these young activists have had, as we can all witness, to turn their courage and so on into real political change. Aung San Suu Kyi, the story still has to be played out. Her heroism, of course, has made her such an icon, such a global actor, but we have to wait and see if that can translate into an ability to continue to map the way forward in her country. And we know the kind of grubby compromises that are sometimes involved in politics, and that would be anathema, obviously, to the speaker on my left, but that is the reality of political life, and one has to see, and one wishes her, of course, so much good fortune in the period ahead. So much to reflect on about individuals and their scope and possibilities, but also the limitations. And before I turn to the UN, I think it's so important that, you know, we can get very blinkered, we practitioners of the UN, or you academics dealing with the UN. When we think of global actors, we tend to think in our own sphere. But if you think of, you know, business personalities, the Steve Jobeses of the world, or the Mark Zuckerbergs, true global actors, if you think of, you know, some of the great figures in literature, someone like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for example, who has chronicled the conflicts of his continent in a more telling way than probably any diplomatic representative. And today's tomorrow's Bloomsday, the 16th of June, so I can't help quoting James Joyce. And so it was a Bloomsday event last night, not writing a speech, but when you think of some of his wonderful language, there's a tremendous sentence from the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where he talked about forging in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. And as a line to sum up what a writer can do, what a visionary can do, what a human rights activist can do, I think it doesn't get much better than that. Anyway, what I really want to talk about is individuals at the UN, and obviously we've heard a bit about the role of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I might say a word on that too. Secretary General is obviously at the apex of the system. Ban Ki-moon is our 8th Secretary General. All of you know the list that preceded him. Some wonderful people, some people rating very highly in the charisma stakes, the effectiveness stakes, some certainly less noteworthy. As we celebrated the 50th, or marked the 50th anniversary of the death of Jack Hammarskjöld last September, it brought back just how great a Secretary General could be. I know you talked about Kofi Annan at lunchtime today. Ban Ki-moon, I think you will never be able to judge a Secretary General until you see his legacy in the round at the end of his term, and he's obviously just at the beginning of his second term. And I remember saying to him just as he started the second term that second terms can and should be extraordinarily liberating, because you gain the capital in your first term and you can spend that capital in your second term. You're free from the constraints to some degree, of course, not entirely free, but at least you don't have to face a re-election where the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can exercise a veto over your choice. So I think my impression of Ban Ki-moon is extraordinarily committed, hardworking, and has been, I don't want to, this can sound patronising, but I can see him growing in the job, even in the 3 years that I've been here. I mean, you all obviously, you're experts in the United Nations. You know the vagueness of the Charter in relation to the position of the Secretary General, this role that is part CEO, part visionary. Secretary Generals are at their most compelling, their most effective, when they are acting out that visionary role in a way that really commands respect and attention. But you know as well the kind of constraints on the individual, the relationship with the Security Council that has to be worked through, worked out all the time, that there has to be mutual respect, some kind of a balance in the relationship. I mean, it's playing out obviously before our eyes in relation to Syria. I mean, I would think there too, just like you give some high marks to the High Commissioner for speaking out in relation to the Arab Spring, I think the Secretary General has spoken out eloquently and well, but of course it can be a little bit, quite a lot obscured by what happens or doesn't happen in the Security Council. The Security Council obviously eventually got its act together in Libya. It has so far totally failed to get its act together in relation to Syria. And the frustration of the Secretary General and Kofi Annan in that regard is perfectly evident. But a point I wanted to touch on, because maybe it's less talked about, is the interaction between the Secretary General and the General Assembly, and the way the General Assembly too, which in many ways you imagine should be the force behind the Secretary General as he tries to manage this difficult interaction and delicate interaction with the Security Council. I feel he's often let down by the General Assembly also. And if I just look back over the last few months and take his sort of double role as CEO and visionary, a couple of things occurred to me. Back in March, we had this really stupid discussion in the Fifth Committee. He had brought in, or his officials had brought in on his behalf, a very modest change management agenda, which was very much about modest nuts and bolts stuff about making the UN work more efficiently. And he was, he and his representatives were absolutely grilled in the Fifth Committee, the Budgetary Committee. They would say, no, this is the prerogative of the Member States, not the Secretary General. You're going too far, you shouldn't be doing this, referring to us. And in the end, what had been such a modest change agenda shrunk even further. So I was thinking, poor man, CEO with 193 fractious members on his board. How do you run a business in that kind of environment? And even in his visionary role, take the Rio conference. Most of my colleagues are already departed for the Rio +20, this conference on sustainable development that's taking place in Rio over the next few weeks. The Secretary General, he has been, absolutely at us and at us and at us, talking about this once-in-a-generational opportunity for transformation, the huge challenge of sustainable development. Be ambitious, live up to the challenge, etc., etc. And we have been in the General Assembly, and we're all collectively responsible for this. we have been producing this draft outcome document that we have eventually dispatched to Rio. It's over 100 pages of pretty, grim, heavy text. There's only 20% of it agreed among the member states. We just haven't done our job. So for all his chivvying us along, and I'm sure Bob Auer spoke to you about the new agenda and all of that, and climate change, I suppose, it's certainly part of it. But we have let him down on that as well, let ourselves down. Hopefully they will pull her out from the hat in Rio, but preparatory work isn't terribly encouraging. But I want to maybe just move on from the Secretary-General job to keeping with this theme of individuals and can they make a change. I just wanted to talk briefly about two individuals that I admire at the UN and that I think are making a difference by their own imprint of personality and style. First is Michelle Bachelet, head of UN Women. As you know, she was appointed to that job about a year and a half ago at this stage. And it's a difficult job because there are huge expectations, hard to meet the expectations, hard to get the priorities right, hard to get the money in place, all of that. But she has a particular background and personality, and I've seen it at work. A warmth and a common sense and ability to, talk the language that has a resonance for people. And she has a track record. I mean, this is no feminist who learned her feminism in the textbooks. She has been through the mill, obviously in Chile. Her father was a victim of the Pinochet regime. She and her mother suffered torture. They have come through, she has personally come through in an extraordinary way. And the way she frames the task and the challenges and so on, I think couldn't be done quite as effectively by somebody from a different background. So, again, to me, that's an individual making a difference. I wanted to mention as well Margot Wallström because, for a number of reasons, because I admire her very much, but also because of her association with Lund University. She's taken up as chair there, and I think you're going to Lund next year. And what I wanted to say about Margot, she's been a Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Sexual Violence and Conflict for 2 years, and she's done a very, very good job in setting up that office. She has really focused on impunity in a laser-like way. But I just wanted to focus as well on style, because what has impressed me a lot about her, I've heard her make presentations on a number of occasions to the Security Council. And when you get used to being in the Security Council chamber, there's a very particular style that you're used to coming from senior UN officials. And it tends to be a kind of dry, neutered language, analytical and, it makes for very good reading. But it's often not compelling in the way that it needs to be. And Margot, when she has gone there, she has spoken in that rigorous analytical way because clearly, that's what is expected of you and what is necessary. But she has managed to combine it with a voice that is direct, clear, and she hasn't been afraid to express emotion in a way that has an impact. And you sit there in the chamber and, as she talks about sexual violence and conflict, you feel in the room the shadows and the ghosts of some of these women who have suffered such horrible things and so on. And you feel them there accusing the Security Council and the UN generally about the inaction. So again, it's a matter of how an individual can shape a message. And I don't want to overstate it, of course, there's no silver bullets and so on to use those cliches. But if you get the right individual framing the message in the right way, it really can make an impact and can change the way business is done in the UN. Actually, I'm going to skip the High Commissioner for Human Rights until we get to the question and answer session, just because I don't want to overstep my time, and I do want to talk a little bit about ambassadors as individuals. Because this is a theme that perhaps hasn't really been studied enough. Now, I don't know whether I'm maybe taking a bit of license with the title, Global Actors. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that humble ambassadors are global actors, but at least we're there, playing our minor roles maybe, but on a very important global stage. Now, ambassadors, of course, you're there to carry out instructions. I mean, certainly if you're directly contrary to government instructions, you're not going to last long in the job, that's self-evident. But as I have seen time and again in my own role and interacting with other ambassadors, the power of an ambassador to shape the message, to help shape his or her instructions, is a very significant one. And I must say, it's a theme that I've come back to again and again. When I chaired the Commission on Human Rights, the precursor to the current Human Rights Council, back in 1999, and I took as theme for the year, taking responsibility. And I remember in my opening speech, I began with a quotation from Dostoevsky. This is over the entrance to the Red Cross Museum in Geneva. Many of you will probably know it. And the quotation is, "Chacun est responsable de tout devant tous." And it doesn't have exactly the same ring in English, but as French speakers would know, it means each one of us is responsible before all humanity for everything. I mean, it's whether we can ever live up to that is another matter. But I remember choosing it to try to instill that sense of personal responsibility. And I know this is very self-indulgent, but I want to quote from myself, basically, because I came across recently in some search of papers the speech that I made as I concluded the Human Rights Council, the chairing of the Human Rights Commission at the end of the year. And I just, because it resonated with me again, what I said then was, in the end, the responsibilities go beyond the professional to the personal. Many of you will remember that last year, to mark the 50th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the ICRC mounted an exhibition on humanitarian law in the hallway outside this room. Each morning on my way to the chair's office behind the podium, I passed a particular display. One photograph with an accompanying quotation kept catching my eye. It was a photograph of a conflict survivor, and the quotation was, "During the war, each man has to act as a human being for himself, because he must live with himself after the war." The Commission, of course, is not a war, and we should not treat it as such. But the imperative is the same, to be true to human values so that we can live with ourselves into the future when our professional responsibilities have come to an end. And in many ways I've tried to come back over the years to that theme. And it's very interesting, you can see it played out in some dramatic ways, obviously, in recent times at the UN, when you look at, on the one hand, the ambassador of Libya, who at a certain moment distanced himself from the Gaddafi regime. On the other hand, we have the Syrian ambassador who keeps coming back and back and back to explain the policies of the Assad regime. Now, obviously, most of us, we're never going to be faced with those kind of dramatic choices. But there are much more modest ways where we're asked to make our contribution, to make our stand. And there's, again, moving away from that kind of high drama stuff, there is the role of the ambassador in trying to advance the collective interest of the United Nations. And that plays out in very practical ways. One of the things that is seriously wrong with the United Nations at present, in the way we conduct our business in New York, is what I describe as the tyranny of the experts. Most of us have large missions. Important issues have to be delegated to experts who have all the benefits that come with expertise. But they tend to drill down, and it's up to the ambassador to have the larger picture in mind. We leave too much to the experts, and in their drilling down, they are constantly, leaving us in processes like where I described the Rio preparatory processes. We're arguing about minutiae and losing the bigger picture. And we ambassadors collectively really need to tackle that responsibility to have the larger picture. And I often think back, you mentioned my time, and I'm almost finished, my time as ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. And there we have, as many of you know, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, COREPER, that meets once a week, and we try to thrash out everything on the agenda. Now, we were 15 countries at the beginning of my time, we were 25 at the end. It is much easier for a small group like that to act collectively, and we know each other so well. But there is a huge sense in COREPER that you are, on the one hand, acting out the interests of your government in a very robust way, but there's a huge sense of collective custodianship of the European interest as well. And that isn't developed at all enough at the United Nations. Of course it's more difficult, we're a much larger group, 193 ambassadors, a diverse, fractured group, but it should be possible in a way that I haven't seen and haven't been able to encourage its development. to really have that corporate collective sense of being custodians of the larger interests of the United Nations. I was going to, maybe I can finish with a few lines of poetry, can I? I'm kind of watching my time. But because I quoted Joyce earlier, I have to, because many are familiar with this wonderful poem of Seamus Heaney, The Republic of Conscience. And it's about a journey to this, obviously, mythical country, the Republic of Conscience. And he says, there are no porters, no interpreters, no taxis. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of Greek privilege disappeared. And obviously those lines come back to you as we line up, me included, in our limos outside the UN building. But he finishes that beautiful poem as the person leaves the Republic of Conscience. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me when I got home to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own town. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. And that sense of an ambassador as having a dual mandate, a dual responsibility to your own country, to the Republic of Conscience, which, should be another name for the United Nations, that is the idea, but sadly we fall far, far short. Thank you.
Ambassador, if you can deliver that quality of presentation with apposite quotes from Seamus Heaney and James Joyce in just a few hours, we obviously gave you too much notice to present today. But we are really grateful for you stepping into the void for this panel. And it goes without saying that Ireland has played a really major role in the evolution of the UN over the decades, ranging from innovations in peacekeeping to non-development in human rights and development. So we hope that you will encourage the next generation of scholars and UN practitioners both to join ACUNS and to really engage with the UN itself. We now have about 20 minutes, possibly up to 25 if we eat into the next session slightly, for Q&A. As you know by now, there are 2 microphones on the sides of the auditorium, so if you want to ask a question, please come down to the microphone, queue up if necessary, and I'll point to you. Please don't make long statements. Please ask questions. Keep them short. You can direct them either to a named member of the panel or to the panel as a whole. Wonderful. Let's see who is first. So we'll start on that side, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much for an excellent panel. It was very interesting and a very nice way to end our panels for this conference that we've been having over the last couple of days. My name is Lise Howard. I'm a professor at Georgetown University, and I've been a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace this year, and I'm also on the board of ACUNS. And I have a question about individual and group rights. So we've been talking about individual leaders and the ways in which they may make a difference. And when we talk about human rights, I have to say that sometimes I'm puzzled about which human rights we're really talking about, especially when it comes to individual versus group rights. And I think there has been a tendency toward recognizing groups, individual representatives of groups as representing the entire group. But we know that subnational groups are not the same, and their representatives are not on par with representatives of individual states. In other words, states are similar, whereas ethnic groups are very dissimilar in form and content, in groupness. So how do we grapple with this? What I see sometimes is a tension between promoting individual rights, especially individual political rights, as opposed to group rights, especially right now in a place like Syria.
Thank you. I'll maybe take 2 at a time for now, so people don't have to queue for too long. Please.
Yeah, my name is Hasegawa. I'm the former resident coordinator in 3 countries. And I have just one question to Mr. Levine. and then I may just come back to comment. You mentioned, I was not quite clear, that the resident coordinators obstacle or some, to that extent, you are just referring to it, and if you could elaborate on that, please.
Thank you very much. If you two want to sit down for a moment and rest, we'll take a panel to answer those questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Syria, individual versus group rights. I mean, you said a place like Syria, so why don't we go there? Where to start? There's so much to say. I think not to start. I mean, I think, you know, as you said, Ambassador, you know, Syria really does represent the UN at its worst, and the inability of the Security Council to move forward on Syria, the failure of the Security Council to refer top-level Syrian government leaders to the International Criminal Court also goes to the heart of your arguments about the politicization of international criminal justice processes and the ICC, because clearly one of the first responses that we should be seeing from the Security Council is its referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. I have to confess that either I misunderstood your question, in which case for my apology, but if I didn't, I actually don't see the dilemma from a human rights perspective of worrying about individuals versus group rights. For me, in a situation like Syria, the role of human rights organizations like mine, at least I can't speak for others, but the role of Human Rights Watch is clear. It is to impartially, to the best of our knowledge, with all the constraints we have in terms of security and access, to document and describe the violations of human rights of individuals in Syria, be they Sunni or Alawite, be they associated with the government, with the Free Syrian Army, or any other political or ethnic group. And I believe that the most important contribution we can make, and the human rights cause generally can make, is to find ways to impartially and neutrally and dispassionately ensure that the violations of the rights of any individuals are documented and made public without fear or favour. And we ourselves have seen very clearly that that is a very difficult thing to do. For months and months we have been documenting the violations of human rights by the government of Syria and its various security and military forces, which we continue to this day to believe to be the principal violator of human rights in Syria. And in many cases saw kind of no political response from certain political actors, particularly those like the government of Russia, which have been the chief defender of the Syrian government. And then, a couple of months ago, we issued our first report on violations committed by the Free Syrian Army, which provoked a tremendous response, firstly by those who were sympathetic to the Free Syrian Army, who couldn't understand why we were describing their human rights violations when the government was clearly the principal violator. And then, on one bizarre Kafkaesque level, sort of almost humorously, we heard that the Russian government, the Russian ambassador to the UN, who had studiously ignored everything we said about Assad, was waving around our report on the Free Syrian Army in the Security Council chamber, saying, you see, it's a lot more complicated. Even Human Rights Watch says that there are problems on the other side. Suddenly elevating our reportage to a political level, which it hadn't achieved when it documented the rights of the violations by the Syrian government. So in short to say, one is, we know that all those who are monitoring the situation in Syria, there is tremendous concern about ethnic strife, about the possibility of sectarian conflict, about what, if Assad was to go, it would mean for those minority groups which have been more allied with him. But we believe very strongly that our contribution as a human rights organization is to focus on individual rights and to build up from those, and to argue with respect to groups that issues of discrimination and collective response can never be acceptable. But to maintain that focus essentially on individual rights.
Thank you. Quickly, Jan, if you want to say something on that ICC referral.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I learned this week that there has been a letter written by the Swiss ambassador to the Rome Statute parties that they should all do their best to make sure the Security Council refers the matter to the ICC. I'm not sure whether that's the right or the most effective approach, but what is going to be very interesting the next coming week when you will have the G20 summit in Los Cabos, there is a separate meeting scheduled between Obama and Putin. And so I'm very much looking forward to see what, in a certain way, could be the next steps in this whole kind of process. One thing I'd like to remark here, and we could debate it later if you want, but there is something here again that I think is the issue of the, if you want the whole balancing between security and justice, or security, peace and justice. And the Security Council, with all the imperfections it has, there is something there that is difficult. If you consider that there are attempts, and I know how difficult and maybe impossible it is, there are attempts to have a kind of political transition process being launched. Now, I ask you the question, would an arrest warrant against Assad help us to find a solution and to lead that political transition process into a good direction? I'm not entirely sure about that. So, I mean, it's something of a dilemma that also here pops up.
Thank you. So, Ambassador, then I'll come back to Ian for the question on the left.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on what's been said as well, and particularly this very live issue about Syria and whether or not the Security Council should refer Assad to the ICC. Now, obviously one's whole instinct is to say yes in the face of these atrocities, and that Swiss letter that Jan referred to that's in circulation, we have committed to sign that, and we expect in the next couple of weeks that there will be maybe 50 or so cross-regional group of countries signing that letter. At the same time, and I know that this is provocative in a way, but people have been talking about a Yemeni-style solution for Syria, and of course the essence of what happened in Yemen, and it hasn't proved very successful because the troubles are continuing in Yemen, but it was the offer of impunity to President Saleh to step aside, and he accepted that and stepped aside, and we hoped for, it hasn't worked out that way, that would be a real solution. But that was the reality, that people were prepared to hold their noses, basically, and give him impunity in the interests of political settlement. And there, I mean, referring to, it was struck me listening to you, I mean, political, it can't be a pejorative word. When you talk about there's the human rights on the one side, the political, it's almost like the good and the evil. It can't be like that. I mean, we live in a political world. And there is, the Western members of the Security Council are as committed as any of us here. We'd love to see Assad before the ICC. But the task is there. How are we going to get the Russians on board for something that brings the situation forward in Syria? And if we do get them on board, it's not going to be for exactly what we would like to see. And it's a genuine dilemma, it's a political dilemma. What do you, at some stage, might you actually, do a deal with the devil in the interests of the larger good of actually achieving regime change in Syria? On the one hand, you can argue that no, that is absolutely, that the stench is too great from the awful atrocities in Syria, that we couldn't contemplate what we had our noses about in Yemen. On the other hand, you could say this country is spiraling, if not already, in a civil war situation, and that you have to make grubby compromises. So, I mean, I pointed up as a dilemma, I repeat the point, we're ready to put our signature to this letter, but it isn't the kind of the forces of good and the forces of evil. The political world, it's a complex world, and there, for all the failings of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, people might even more allege failings on the part of the Secretary General. Sorry, I'm not going on too long, but there's a whole other discourse on that. But you get the point.
I want to bring in some more questioners, but first, if you, in 1 minute here, if you can both answer the question over there if you want to say something about us living in a political world.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, what I just said at the beginning was that the UN is a deeply political institution in the best and worst senses of the word. The worst is obvious. The best is, yes, of course, a place where power is exercised and important decisions are made. And, you know, as much as I try to argue for principle to be at the heart of it, I absolutely recognize that we have to engage with that political processes in all senses of it. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's a simplistic dichotomy like that. And I think the questions of impunity and how one handles it are incredibly difficult. I would still argue that an ICC referral is essential, because otherwise you provide Assad with no incentive to step down. But I recognize it's very, very difficult. On the question of the resident coordinator, let's talk afterwards in more detail, because I'm happy to do so. I glossed over it very, very quickly because I was running out of time. But essentially what I was trying to argue was that too often we've seen in a number of critical situations, particularly in countries where governments are extremely abusive to their people, that the UN system, led by the resident coordinator system, has hesitated to confront governments over their human rights violations for fear of compromising the ability to provide important development and humanitarian services, and sort of finding the right balance between confronting governments over their abuses and supporting governments to provide effective development services has tended to lean towards the development rather than the human rights. Sometimes
I think that's a very important point. That's why I wanted to share with you. I give you one specific example. In Timor-Leste, I had to confront Joseph Ramos Horta, the foreign minister, and he was president later on. And I had 12 human rights monitors sent by Geneva and part of the mission. And they're all good people, and we worked hard to, to impress upon the government and so forth. Now, what Ramos Horta said to me is this, because he went to Geneva and he read the report, and he was furious in the sense that he felt that the human rights situation in his country was misrepresented. He said, look, Hasegawa, why don't you help us by sending these 12 human rights monitors in each of the government offices, Prime Minister's office and so forth, and help us to improve our situation in the country, rather than just purely trying to expose or in an exaggerated form. I was, in fact, very responsible for that, in going over the report. But you know that the process is that these human rights monitors, they report directly to Geneva, and they write the report, and that the resident coordinator doesn't have the power to go over and review and so forth. I'm just giving you one example to see how each country may differ in their situation.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa. For those of you who don't know, the Professor was a very distinguished former UN Special Representative for East Timor, so I hope we can continue this discussion afterwards. Before I ask these two people who have waited a long time to ask their question, can I see a show of hands for anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Is there anyone else? No? Wonderful, great. I think we'll finish with these two then. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Patricia Villa. I'm a recent graduate from the Fletcher School, and my question is specifically for Jan Wouters, or if any of the panelists also wants to add something, I would be grateful. And I would like to know which is the role of victims when we balance all these issues of discretion and accountability, considering that the exercise of this discretion will impact the access of justice to victims and, of course, eventual reparations or even participation in the proceedings. I mean, should victims have a say in how the prosecutor exercises this discretion? Should there be any accountability mechanisms for them?
Great, thank you. Patrick Hayford.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Hayford from the United Nations. Just a quick comment on the imperatives of justice and the imperatives of peace. You mentioned the example of Yemen, but I'd like to draw your attention to the example of Charles Taylor. At a critical point in Liberia, the question was how to get Mr. Taylor out of the way so the Liberian peace process could move ahead. In the end, President Obasanjo of Nigeria undertook to take him in, take good care of him. As a result of that, the Liberian peace process was able to move forward. And later, much later, Charles Taylor is now in The Hague, has been convicted. So sometimes the question of sequencing has to be handled very carefully. Now my question to both Mr. Wouters and to Mr. Levine. Mention was made about the ICC referral and its politicization. Now we have a big problem in Africa. Ordinary people in Africa are cheering to see these tyrants and dictators at last being brought to justice. However, the official government community, the elites and the bureaucrats, of whom I used to be one, and the policy people are protesting vigorously about the role of the ICC, and it seems to be targeting Africa. How, with the assumption of duty of the new African lady, head of the process, how are those of us who believe in human rights, how are we going to rescue this whole progress in human rights from being distorted and being denigrated and set back by the politicization of the referral process? I'll be very interested to hear what Mr. Wouters has to say, and especially Mr. Levine. But thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Two excellent questions to end the panel. So I'll go in order of the original panel speakers. So start with you, Jan.
Okay, well, these are two very interesting questions. Thank you. They're also very broad, and I may not be in the possibility to address it with enough nuances here, but I would imagine that at the reception or something else, we could continue a bilateral discussion about this. As to the victims, I'll be very brutal with you, but I believe that we should be very careful about raising too high expectations with victims. It's a very sensitive matter, and I think that the ICC may have, in a certain way, in good faith, raised the expectations very high. Set a very high threshold in terms of reparation, but also in terms of the idea of participation in some kind, quote-unquote, in the whole process. I think that those criminal lawyers and judges that I know who have encountered or have dealt with the matter have all been somewhat reluctant in saying that we should involve them too deeply into the process. It's very delicate. First of all, at the emotional, psychological, human level, it's extremely delicate because these people have direct things at stake, and that touches very deeply. But also, I think, with regard to the whole business that is woven around it, you see a creation also of a certain international criminal justice business. And I think we should also in that respect watch out in not like raising expectations and what have you. I think it will lead inevitably to all kinds of frustrations, deep dissatisfaction. And that is, we should, I think, and also a prosecutor should make sure that justice is done. And justice must be done, and you can have all kinds of discussions and theoretical discussions about retribution and what have you, but I think it can be very important for the victims to be in some way associated to the process, but I'm expressing myself very, very vaguely, and I don't think to the prosecution itself. That's why we have prosecutors. You have a third entity, a third party that has to make a case, that also has to, I think, make, to a certain extent, abstraction of individual emotions, and really go for, you know, a certain aim to be achieved: justice, prevention. That's another important thing. I think, I mean, it was touched upon in an earlier remark, but I think that the ICC's role in that sense, apart from the whole, if you wish, punitive function, there's also the preventative function, the conflict prevention function, which is mentioned in the preamble of the Rome Statute, and which I think nowadays, also with the Arab Spring in mind, is taking a new dimension, where you see also the prosecutor recently having started investigations in processes like in Kenya and in Cote d'Ivoire, where you saw a distortion of the outcome of democratic election processes, and where in fact, to some extent, you will see even a kind of lowering of the thresholds of what we call crimes against humanity and so on, in a process in which also a prosecutor is intervening in order to restore stability and make sure democratic processes can go on. Just to say, again, as a kind of illustration of how international criminal justice may be evolving and may be taking on also different roles, and there too we have to treat very carefully. But just to say also with regard to victims, I think it's a very delicate thing, and I'm afraid the ICC may have raised the expectations a bit too high. We will see how the next prosecutor deals with that. As to the referral and the politicization question, and then very specifically the African question, where you have maybe the people on the ground who may cheer the various initiatives and referrals and so on, but the political elites that have reacted very angrily. And I've seen that, I'm from Belgium, I've seen that from multiple sides. We had universal jurisdiction laws which have been abolished or at least watered down considerably, not because of the Africans, but because of very strong United States pressure. I'm coming to my end. But there has been an enormous riot between the European countries and the African Union with regard to universal jurisdiction. And the African Union also has taken positions there that I really wonder what is the agenda. For instance, also in the case against Hissène Habré, where Belgium had launched an extradition request to Senegal, where the Senegalese president refused and all kinds of complications came in, until the moment that Belgium even went to the International Court of Justice, yet another court in The Hague, in order to have Senegal condemned for not complying with its international legal obligations. All these things show that there are needs, again, politics come up. The African Union leaders, if I recall well, they've also said we're going to set up an African alternative to the International Criminal Court. I'm still waiting to see what that alternative will exactly be. I'm not very, very hopeful, but I think the fact that the new prosecutor is indeed an African is extremely important. I think that's good by itself. I don't think that should have been the sole or the principal criterion for electing her, but okay, she's now there. So she will face a very, very important and delicate task of bringing Africa back on board.
Thank you very much. Ian.
Thank you for those questions, really good. One of the most inspiring, or some of the most inspiring images I can recall seeing in recent years were pictures that were taken in Congo and in Liberia and Sierra Leone on the first days of the trials of Thomas Lubanga, the Congolese warlord who was recently convicted by the ICC, and of Charles Taylor. Images that were taken of people in those countries, many of them victims of those men, watching the court proceedings on TV and seeing their ability to see Taylor and Lubanga brought to justice and brought to fair trials, not vengeful trials, but fair trials according to international criminal justice standards, was extraordinarily important. And the outreach work of the International Criminal Court and other international tribunals, ensuring that justice is not only done, but seen to be done, and seen to be done by the victims, is hugely important. And something that we at Human Rights Watch take incredibly seriously. And where we've been critical sometimes of the ICC, and we have, one of those areas of criticism has been in not investing enough resources in outreach to victim communities, so that these trials and the justice that is handed out at these trials, that they are really seen as processes which help to rebuild justice systems and systems for the protection of human rights in these countries going forward, and not simply as vengeance for the victims. Incredibly important. Thank you for reminding us that it's not a question of peace versus justice, that peace and justice are interlinked. That is, it's very difficult to imagine sustainable peace without justice and accountability. But obviously in real life they may have to be sequenced. And the example of Charles Taylor, I think, is an interesting one. He was removed from Liberia in order to advance the political process, but there was a tremendous effort to ensure that this was not an amnesty, and that he was eventually brought to trial. It's obviously a risky strategy, because once someone is removed from a situation, as we've seen with President Saleh being removed from office in Yemen, the worry always is that there will be a loss of political momentum to maintain the focus on accountability. It certainly worked out in the case of Charles Taylor, and one does recognise that sequencing may need to be part of the process. In terms of just one word very quickly on Africa, because Jan spoke well on it. I agree that Fatou Bensouda, the new African prosecutor, I think it's very important that she can lead the dialogue with African governments. It's also very encouraging, despite the pushback that there has been in Africa against the ICC, and it's a very real pushback, that there was a very hopeful sign recently. The new president of Malawi announced that she would not allow President Bashir, the indicted by the ICC, the president of Sudan, indicted by the ICC, she announced that she would not allow him to come to Malawi to attend the AU summit that she was hosting. And there was a lot of pushback against her because of that. But she has stuck to her guns, and I think it does represent a sign that there are African leaders who are recognizing the importance of respecting the jurisdiction of the court and respecting the incredibly important role the court plays. But it will be a huge challenge going forward, protecting not only the impartiality of the court, but the perception of it.
Thank you. Ambassador Anderson.
Well, the questions weren't really addressed to me in a shorter time, so I won't add much. Just a sentence to say that I see it all the time in the United Nations, exactly what you're talking about, this perception. It's a leitmotif from so many of the African diplomats in so many settings, this complaint that the ICC is disproportionately and unfairly focused on Africa. And that was why, when there were many good candidates for the prosecutor role, and they came and they were interviewed and held sessions and so on in New York, for us, having an African was tremendously important. I mean, obviously a well-qualified, able African, but in order to deal with this perception that Africa is being, as I say, disproportionately and unfairly targeted for ICC referrals.
Thank you all for coming to this penultimate session. I can't think of a better way to end with a final interactive session of the type we've had. First, as is customary, I'm delighted on behalf of ACUNS to present each of our panelists with a copy of the ACUNS Journal Global Governance and complimentary one-year membership to ACUNS. Those of you who are already members can pass these on to that's your one now, personally named. In a moment, we will all, the four of us, will depart from the panel, and I'd like to invite the current and the incoming chairs to come up and replace us for the final remarks. But before we do so, I'd like to ask you to join me in expressing our warm appreciation for such rich, candid, and illuminating presentations.